he'll be calling for member states to try and up the cash given the threat the world's facing at the moment.
Yeah, really fascinating this, isn't it, Isabel, that in many ways the Prime Minister's come here to the first day of a really important NATO summit, trying to encourage other countries to increase their NATO spending. He's going to tell essentially other NATO members to dig deep into their pockets to restore what he says is deterrence and ensure defence in the decade ahead. He says that that target of 2% should not be a ceiling but a floor for those NATO members. Now, it is fair to say that Britain does spend, it's a bit dispute about the figures, but it certainly spends over 2% of its GDP on defence. Many other countries have not met that target in the past, though that is obviously changed with the war in Ukraine. But the reason it's fascinating is because there's this big debate back home involving the Defence Secretary Ben Wallace, who clearly wants to see UK defence spending increase even further. Suggestions that he would like to see it increase to 2.5% of GDP. Frankly, he argues that actually the defence forces have been cut back too much. But there seems to be a bit of reticence in Number 10, not least also in the Treasury, about just how much that would cost. And there are concerns, actually, that real-term spending on defence could fall because of rising inflation in the years ahead. So I think there is domestic pressure, and there certainly will be questions of the Prime Minister today about just how much he's prepared to increase the defence spending for the UK, to increase the size, frankly, of our armed forces. In addition to that, obviously, here at NATO, there's the talk about the expansion with Finland and Sweden now essentially being allowed into the club after a deal with Turkey last night. That is a very, very significant moment for the alliance, but also for those countries after decades of neutrality. And in addition to that, we're going to get confirmation, I think, as well, Isabel, a little bit later on, that NATO is going to increase their forces they've got on alert from 30,000 to 400,000. So a massive increase, essentially, in the deterrence that we're going to see of the NATO forces, particularly in Eastern Europe, given the threat from Russia. And that will probably mean not just hundreds but thousands more British personnel involved in all of that. And I'll also leave you with this thought, which is quite interesting, that Boris Johnson gave an interview to German television last night when he was asked, obviously, about President Putin and the reasons behind that war. And he suggested it's because he's a man. He told them, said that if Putin was a woman, which he obviously isn't, but if he were, I really don't think he would have embarked on a crazy macho war of invasions and violence in the way he has. He says it's a perfect example of toxic masculinity.
Darren, by and large, are the vibes you're getting coming from within the G7, are they a united group, or are there any major fractions or divisions between them?
I think it's really interesting, this, isn't it, Amy? That, yeah, I think at the G7 there were suggestions that we could see a few fractures in the Western alliance. There were suggestions that President Macron of France was potentially trying to get essentially Ukraine to concede something to try and get a peace deal with Russia. But actually, Emmanuel Macron and all the G7 leaders came out yesterday and said, no, Ukraine needs to win this war. That is the only acceptable solution to all of that. I think within NATO, actually, there is an awful lot of agreement. There is agreement across the board, not least of all because within NATO, outside of the G7, but within NATO, you've got those Eastern European countries like the Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, with Poland as well, who take the hardest line on all of this. And particularly with American support as well, I think there is a really strong alliance. Of course, for the Ukrainians, though, they say, well, it's all very well and good that you've got our back in terms of words, but what we need to see is action, and there will be greater calls. And I suspect we will see something like this over the next couple of days, where there will be even more weapons delivered from the West to Ukraine. Because in the end, if Western leaders want Ukraine to win this war, they're not going to win it with words, they will only win it with weapons.